Hey everybody, this is Carter and welcome to this episode of Making It Up, the conversation series where I get to sit down and talk with other writers, some who I know, some who I'm just meeting for the first time, some who I know of. So it's always exciting and I'm never quite sure what we're going to talk about, but I'm always fascinated in their journey and kind of where they are now and what that writing life cycle has looked like for them. So before I get to today's guest, I just want to make a quick note that you should totally check out my company's website, unboundwriter.com. At Unbound Writer, we do writing retreats, we do one-on-one coaching, and I'm happy to announce we just launched our first 3 online courses, and they look so cool. A lot of work was put into these online courses. They are very affordable, so I highly encourage you to check that out, unboundwriter.com. So today on the show, I had J.D. Barker. It's a pretty big name. You've probably heard of J.D. Barker, but he is the New York Times and international best-selling author of just many, many, many novels, including Dracul and The Fourth Monkey. I do believe I have a copy of The Fourth Monkey on my bookshelves right now. And he's also collaborated with James Patterson on 4 or 5 different books. So he's been very busy. His most recent release that was just under his name is Behind a Closed Door, which is an erotic thriller. So we talked a lot about the industry actually, and how JD started as a book doctor and a ghostwriter, and it became very well known to the point that a lot of books that he was ghostwriting were hitting the Times bestseller lists. But then he started writing on his own and producing his own novels, and he had great success with that, so much so that he was able to pursue writing as a full-time job. So it's been fantastic for him. We talked about the ups and downs of writing and the controllables and the uncontrollables. And this led to a conversation about something that happened in early 2024, late 2023 with JD. The analogy being sending a text to somebody you didn't mean to, only in his case, it was sending a newsletter to the wrong newsletter list. But because that newsletter content was very specific to his erotic thriller and had some racy content in it that was meant for influencers who deal with that all the time, and it would have been appropriate, it was accidentally sent to the wrong newsletter list, and it became, because he's well known, it became a huge uproar. And so we discussed that and just like what happened, what was the aftermath of this. So it was pretty fascinating to hear. And as he kind of says, a cautionary tale. And again, he didn't do it, but he accepts the blame because it's his name that's on everything, and that's part of the reality of any career, really. So anyway, it was fascinating. It was good to talk to him. I did see some parallels between our 2 lives in terms of what we write and the idea of, right now I'm currently trying to figure out a way to write full time without looking for a corporate job and burning through savings as I do. And he kind of went through that phase as well. So it was interesting to talk about that as well. This was a really good one. I think you're going to enjoy it. This is my conversation with JD Barker. Are you at this point in your life when you start a book and you get 50 pages in and it's not for you, are you done?
Oh, you wait until 50 pages? I've gotten so thick, it's bad. I used to finish it, and my wife still will. She'll read a full book, 400 or 500 pages, even if she hates it, just to get to that finish line. I used to cut out 25, 50 pages in, but now it's like if they don't get me in that first couple sentences, the first page, I'm gone. And publishers send me all these ARC copies, so like I've got a stack to choose from. So it's not like I don't have plenty of material to dig into.
Well, and that's just it too. When you get a lot of free copies, then your motivation is lower. If you go out and you buy a book or somebody gives you a gift, I do feel like for me, there's a little bit more of I should give this more of a shot. Somebody really recommended it, or I really thought this was going to be good, and I spent $26 on it. So
honestly, in my world, like it sticks in my head. So if the writing isn't up to par, like I feel it's going to dumb down mine. Like and it will, like it sneaks into your head, So like if it's just not up to where your writing standards are, like sometimes it's bad to stick with it.
Yeah, that's a good point. It depends on what you're reading too. I don't read a lot of. I mean, I'm dark suspense, and I don't read a lot of that. I read mostly nonfiction because that kind of frees my head, and the stories are always amazing.
Yeah.
But if you're like judging a contest, say, and all of a sudden you have 40 books, that's 5 to 50 page commitment max, unless you're like, okay, this has potential. But if you know within a few pages, like this is not going to, it's okay, but it's not going to be the winner, then it's easy to disregard.
Yeah, well, you can tell. I mean, today's world, our attention spans are just short.
Right. They are. But that also makes the responsibility for you as a writer a little bit different maybe than what it used to be. And I think when you're writing suspense thriller, you don't want to waste any time. So you should be writing that way anyway. But now more than ever, like I'm always amazed when people are like, yeah, the first page was good, but then it lost me in the pages 2 through 5. Like there's no room for anything to breathe anymore, which puts on more responsibility. I mean, do you think about those things when you're writing? Do you think about like, is this grabbing them fast enough?
Well, I spent almost 20 years working as a book doctor and a ghostwriter. So I would get hired by agents and publishers to take a book that was, at 80% of its potential and get it to that 100%. And honestly, a lot of times that meant cutting the first chapter or cutting the first page. A lot of authors don't find their stride until they get to that second chapter. I feel a book needs to start with action. And at this point, I've written, I think 5 books now with James Patterson. And like we spend so much time on the phone, even when I'm not talking to him, if I write a sentence, like I can hear him over my shoulder going, nope, not good enough. you need something better to hold them. Go back and try again.
And you do hear those voices in your head, right? Because how often is it that I have no context. Usually when I'm writing a book, I think it's good, but I'm like, I have no context because I haven't shared this with anyone yet. And then I will hear like my agent or my editor's voice in my head say, and I'm like, I know. I'll cut it down when I get to the editing. But I'm having fun right now. But yeah, you need to immediately, and it doesn't have, in my opinion, it doesn't have to be action necessarily. I think that's good, but it has to just be this immediate sense of menace where someone's going to want to know more, I think.
It's got to be compelling. A lot of authors will try to do a quick information dump at the very beginning to kind of set the stage or create their world or whatever it is. And a lot of times you can skip all that, go to the very first line of dialogue, actually start the book, and then you can piece that information in a little slowly, a page or 2 in. You can, take a paragraph and dump it in there and break it up a little bit. And it causes it just to flow a little faster. That doesn't necessarily mean you write it that way. I mean, most of us, I think, would write it, linear, and then go back and change it,
pepper and things. Yeah, and I think it's easy not to give the audience the credit for being as smart as they are. I think the best analogy I can think of is I think of the pilot episode of Breaking Bad, where you have zero idea as a viewer what is happening. It's so chaotic. You don't know who the characters are. You don't know what's happening, but you're so compelled to want to know more without any kind of explanation of what you just saw. And to me, that's what a good thriller is like that first chapter can just make no sense, but it can be like, I need to know what that was all about. But that, like you said, that takes time. And sometimes you're realizing like, all right, I'm cutting chapters 1 through 4 because chapter 5 is really where the story starts.
Yeah, I mean, Breaking Bad is a great example of that, and Better Call Saul is just as good.
Yes.
I watched all those as a fan, from the get-go, and then I went back and watched them again, with my professional hat on and a notepad out, because they do it through, to tie up, if you watch Better Call Saul, to tie up both series the way that they did so expertly. I mean, it is phenomenal. Like you need to just completely pick it apart because they had Easter eggs that they planted, some of the early seasons of Breaking Bad. And, I know how the writer's room works. At the time, they had no clue that that's where it was going, but they were smart enough to go back when they were writing Better Call Saul and look for those and pick them out and seed them in, to make it seem like they had this entire master plan together from the get-go. And that's where the real, writing is, editing is where the story really comes together, not necessarily the writing.
It is. And one thing that's, and it's the subtle touches. So if you think about Better Call Saul, their opening credits always broke in the middle of a guitar chord. And then it would go. So you were waiting for the end of that guitar chord and they always cut it. So it was this weird sense of angst and anticipation. The smallest little thing creates this sense of anticipation in you. I just thought they were brilliant on all levels with that show for sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you're in New Hampshire, right? Or is that where you live?
Yeah, I live on a small island right off the coast of Portsmouth. We're about an hour and 20 minutes north of Boston.
Oh, okay. I've set three of my novels in New Hampshire, maybe four actually. Because one of my novels, I'm like, I need a creepy place to set this book because it's going to be in October. So I decided New England, and I just kind of happened upon Manchester because it was the size of a city that I needed. Because New England's either Boston or tiny, tiny little towns.
Right.
So I flew to Manchester and spent some days there. And since then, I'm like, man, it's just, there's something about New Hampshire that just works well for what I write. So I ended up actually making up a fictitious town called Bury, outside of Boston. But yeah, how long have you lived there for?
We moved here in 2019, so right before COVID hit.
Okay.
And yeah, there's character everywhere. Like we saw this house on the third time. I realized there was actually a cemetery in the backyard, and like the real estate agent didn't even tell us. And I was like, you know what kind of stuff I write, right? Like you should have led with that.
Right.
But like there is
right.
literally
I'll pay more.
you throw a stone and there is something story worthy. I mean, Paul Revere rode right past my house. You know,
That's amazing.
History everywhere around here.
Where are you from originally? Where'd you grow up?
Well, I was born in Chicago, a little town called Crystal Lake, which has nothing to do with the Friday the 13th movies. We were about an hour north of Chicago, but my dad was a contractor, and he just got tired of the winters, you know, working outside in Chicago winter. So when I was around 13 or 14, he moved us to Florida, and I honestly I hated it because I was so used to having seasons. You know, like I moved my snowmobile to Florida because I wouldn't give it up. We put wheels on it, you know, like I held on to that thing. But when the book started taking off, my wife and I, we were living in Pittsburgh, and we realized we can live anywhere in the world. We went on a road trip through New Hampshire, and we just kind of fell in love. And we stumbled into this little island. And once we saw it, we were like, this is it. We just got to figure out how to make it work.
Wow.
It's one of those places where it's small. Like you have to kind of get in with a cash office or offer before the house hits the market or it's gone.
Oh, wow.
We ended up buying this. We bought this house that was literally abandoned. There were raccoons and stuff living inside and holes in the roof. Took it down to the studs and spent 2.5 years renovating it, but it was so worth it.
But that's such a fun. I love the idea. Like I built this house, which was just 22 years old now, but just that process of, even if it takes forever, even if things go wrong, which they will go wrong, because it's an act of creation, which is, I think, speaks to most authors in general, just making those decisions, seeing it come to life, making mistakes and trying to correct them. I think it's a lot of fun.
Oh, it's even more fun when you're actually living in the house and you have no kitchen for 4 months and you're doing dishes in the bathroom.
And raccoons.
And raccoons. Yeah, that's what you do.
When did you start writing?
I've honestly been writing my entire life.
Yeah.
Professionally, I went to college in Fort Lauderdale, and I majored in music and business. My parents were adamant about telling me you can't make a living as a writer. They tried to drill that into my head, but it was always my
They're
side
not
hustle.
unwise for saying that.
Not at all. Like I tell my daughter the same thing. Like this is not the norm. Like
right.
But so I was in school for business. One of my first jobs down there, I worked for BMG Records, which is a division of RCA, and I was basically a glorified babysitter. So if you ever seen Get 'Em to the Greek, that was my life. So I would pick up recording artists at the airport, I have to get them to the radio station, get them to their concerts, get them back on the airplane. And after a while, I realized I'm in a car with some very famous people for a couple of days, you know, so I started interviewing them and then selling those interviews to magazines like Teen Beat and Tiger Beat and Teen People and 17. And to really date myself, this was people like Tiffany and Debbie Gibson and New Kids on the Block.
Yeah.
Then we got the hair bands, Poison, Motley Crue, Bon Jovi. If I had everybody from Guns N' Roses in South Florida for a full week and I didn't lose anybody, you know, and got them back on the airplane, like that was a win. But I loved it. But my parents just kept saying, you got to go into the corporate world. You need a real job. So I got a degree in finance and I worked in that world for 20 some years. My last real job, I was a chief compliance officer at a brokerage firm. Which is as horrible as it sounds. And I would come home at night and I would write to stay sane.
Yeah. Well, we have parallels because I was hospitality real estate finance major. And I was in that world of I have a separate side gig that I still do consulting within that industry. But you start writing and you start feeling like, okay, I think it's something about you are creating your own vision and you are not working towards somebody else's vision. And that's what corporate jobs are like. You might love it. You might love the people. But ultimately what you're working for is not something you came up with for most people. And so you are supporting somebody else's vision, and you could be aligned with that, but it's still not the same as like, I'm making this shit up completely. And that's exciting because the stakes are high.
They're high, but but you're 100% in control from start to finish. If you fall on your face, it's your own fault. It's not because of somebody, that works down the hall.
Right.
Right. But yeah, I mean, I'm doing what I love. I literally get to make shit up for a living. You can't beat that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, that being said, there are still, and I do coaching and book doctoring as well. So one of the things I tell my students is we work together on like, what can you control and what can't you? Because there's a lot you can control. As we know, even just shopping a book when you're first starting out, and how many letters do you get? I love this book. I love the writing. It's just not what we're looking for right now. It's like, well, you did the best you could. You wrote a great book, but you can't control whether it's going to fit with this publisher or not. What was your experience like writing that first novel and trying to get an agent, if you can remember back that far?
Oh yeah, I remember very, very vividly. So when I was in the corporate world, I was working as a book doctor and a ghostwriter at night. I had 6 different books that hit the New York Times list, all with other people's names on the cover that I essentially wrote. And that gets old after a while. So at one point, my wife pulled me aside and she said, "Look, I know you want to make a living as a writer. Let's try and figure out how to make this happen." And we were kind of stuck because my salary was a little over $250,000 a year plus bonuses.
Wow.
We had a big house in Florida. We had cars.
A lot to walk away from.
And the monthly nut just to support all that was like $10,000 to $12,000. So like I couldn't just leave the salary because we couldn't afford to just walk away. So she came up with this crazy plan. She found a duplex in Pittsburgh that we ended up buying. We sold everything that we owned. We bought this duplex. We rented out one side and lived in the other. And essentially, I got to live off of savings for about 18 months to write that first book.
Wow.
It's nothing like putting your feet to the coals. I mean, she basically said, "You've got a little under 2 years to get this done and make it happen, or we're going to have to find some real jobs again."
Right.
And I got lucky. The first one ended up selling really well, and it's been a roller coaster ever since.
Well, I have a couple of questions there. First of all, prior to writing your first novel, how were you getting known and getting work as a book doctor and a ghostwriter?
It really came out of those magazine articles because I was working for so many newspapers and magazines. And once you get to know people in that world, you quickly realize they all have a novel in a desk drawer somewhere that they've been working on forever. It's 400,000 words long. They've been working on it for 10 years. It's almost done. Just needs a little tweaking. And like they would hand those off to me because I was very good with grammar and punctuation, but also with the developmental side. So it started off as just a side hustle. Yeah, I'll read it. It was fun. So I would go through, I'd edit it, tell them what they needed to do to fix it. When those started to sell, word just got out. They told their friends.
Right. That's interesting.
And then eventually I started getting phone calls from agents. An agent would pick up a book that they really liked, but the author wasn't capable of fixing the few things in it that they didn't like about it. It's too long. Dialogue needs some work. Combine these characters, stuff like that. Sometimes people are just too close. So agents would hire me. And once I started working for agents, then I started getting similar phone calls from editors at publishers. We just picked up this book. It's really close to being done, but it needs a little work. And what I really like, that's where I learned how to write, because, if you have an editor, if you're an author, your editor calls you, they basically, if they've got something bad they've got to tell you, they'll tell you 10 great things about your book. Then they sneak in the one bad thing, and then they tell you 2 or 3 more good things to try and sandwich that before they, hang up the phone call. But when I was coming in, I was a hired gun. So they didn't hold anything back. They would flat out tell me this person can't write dialogue to save their life. This storyline needs to go, this needs to happen. But once I got that type of feedback, like I really knew what editors and publishers were looking for. So when I sat down to write my first book and the book since, I've always kept that in mind. Yeah,
that's invaluable advice. And I feel like, I don't know, this is my opinion, in today's market, if you have a book and you can't write dialogue to save your life, the agent's not even going to care enough. They're going to be like, no, I've got enough. It's got to be nearly perfect as it is in order to at least even have me take you on as a client. So that's interesting that back then you were having agents who were working with their own clients who they had already taken on, who had some pretty big deficiencies.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes it really changed a lot with the internet, because I've been, I started this on a typewriter, so it's been a while.
Right. Yeah.
But with the internet, margins got smaller. Editors couldn't spend quite as much. Where 10, 15 years ago, they could take on a book as a project if they liked the idea. They knew they had to put some work into it. Today's world, they just don't have the time anymore. They don't have the budget for it. That book. I mean, I tell people all the time, if you're going to write a book, it's got to be perfect before it leaves your desk, because once an agent sees it, if it's not perfect, it's dead in the water. There's
Right.
not a whole lot you can do anymore.
Right. And everyone's so concerned about it. I'm always interested, like teaching at conferences and things like that, where the conference is really focused on social media and newsletters and all the other things. And I do think people tend to lose focus. They keep thinking, authors think, I've got to do all this other shit, which is kind of true. There's some shit you have to do, but they lose sight of the fact that the book's got to be great. That's the bare minimum you have to do, is the book has to be great. And that's the hardest thing to do. I think
the truth of it is, the only thing that really sells books is word of mouth.
Yeah.
You can prop up any book. You can take the worst book in the world and you can buy enough Facebook ads and Amazon ads to get it to hit a list somewhere. But the second you pull the stopper on that and you end those things, the book fizzles and dies because people aren't talking about it. To give you an example, the Fourth Monkey, which is my first serial killer book, it's been almost 10 years since I wrote that book. We haven't advertised it in probably 9 years, but it still hits the Amazon bestseller list. And it's strictly because of word of mouth. It catches on in a particular Facebook group. Everybody starts talking about it. Then they buy that one, they buy the series, and then they start going through the rest of my back catalog. Like, that's what you need. I mean, you've got to write a 5-star book to succeed today.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And sometimes you don't know what that's going to be. You just kind of, I think it's really important to write what speaks to you, because that's where you find the joy in writing and you're having fun. And then that's going to come through no matter how dark the book is. But I do think, I guess I started writing in 2003. I didn't start publishing until 2012. But things have changed immensely since then. But I do believe you've got to do enough PR, even if it's out of your own pocket, to get you that opportunity to have word of mouth spread, because you can have an amazing book that would be the talk of the town and it just gets lost because nothing was done supporting that book. So and I don't know what that bare minimum is. I don't know what that threshold is. It's definitely getting in the hands of the right people, the right influencers, the right Goodreads readers early on, who have a lot of followers. But you're right. If it's not a good book, then it will just fizzle ultimately.
Well, it's similar to lighting the fuse, on something. Like you have to do enough marketing to light that fuse, but then it needs to carry on its own, once you let it go.
Right.
I mean, today's world, some of the best tools out there. I mean, NetGalley is fantastic. For getting early buzz going. A mailing list is still, I just wrote an article for Rolling Stone talking about mailing lists. Like, that is still key, I think, to any author business.
Because you own that, you can take that mailing list wherever you go.
Yeah, I mean, I've got a simple form on my website for media people to fill out, and media being newspapers, magazines, bloggers. I don't care if you've got an audience, I'm willing to send you a book. Every book, that list gets longer and longer. There's something like almost 3,000 or 4,000 people on there now. Wow. So anytime I release a title, I just kick it out to that list, and the bulk of them request a copy. They tend to talk about it, they review it, and for the next book, that list will be another 10% bigger, and you keep going. But we all start with zero, on that list. It's all friends and family at best, and you just build from there.
Yeah, I started my newsletter probably 8 years ago, and that's how it started. And you just hope that people spread the word, but you got to be consistent about it. You have to react to people. You have to follow up with people. You can't just think it just sits there and all these good things are going to happen. You have to be actively engaged, and that gets a little exhausting too. But that's part of the racket, I think. It's interesting what you said earlier. There was a parallel I was thinking about when you were talking about moving to the duplex in Pittsburgh, and like you have this clock ticking, this 18-month clock. A couple of years ago, same thing, executive level corporate job. and it was a consulting firm. It was a consulting firm that got bought by a multinational. And then about a year and a half after post acquisition, they're like, we are getting rid of all consulting because that's just not what we do. And so I was let go for the first time in my life from this very high paying, cushy, great health insurance, that kind of a thing. And I started kind of looking around for other jobs, and I'm like, you know what, this is what I want to do. I want to write. I want to coach. I want to do retreats. I want to do online classes. And so that's the phase I'm in. I was telling someone the other day, I'm like, I am working harder now and making less money than ever, but I feel more fulfilled than I've ever have been, even though that savings clock is ticking. Now, thank God for savings, because after, as you get old enough, like you said, you have a lifestyle that you are trying to support. And at the very least, you can cut down on a lot of stuff, but you still have mortgage or mortgages maybe. And so you're like, yeah, I need this shit to work because this is what I want to do with the rest of my life. And I don't want to go back to a corporate job.
Well, my wife did. I mean, she's a very smart woman. So not only did she come up with that plan, but once the book started selling, she came up with another one, and she took the money that came in and she put it into real estate. So rather than taking those advance checks and royalty checks and putting them in the checking account and using them towards utilities, we bought properties. So at this point, we've got a pretty decent portfolio of rental units around the country. So I could quit writing today if I wanted to. So like my income doesn't necessarily have to come from writing anymore because we've got that. I talk to writers all the time at conferences about that. I mean, because I worked in finance, so and one of the things that always sticks with me is back when I was, in my teens working for those record labels, I used to see so many people, they would have that one hit song and, like money would just come flooding in and they would buy a big old house or rent a big house on Miami Beach. They'd have
something that starts depreciating from day one.
Yeah. And, like just expecting that to continue. And then their next song would come out and it would fizzle and die. It would hit like number 18 on the charts and then be gone. And, a month later, I saw the house go away. I saw their Lamborghini get traded in and now they're driving a Toyota, and like it was just this downward thing because nobody saved. So like that has always scared the crap out of me.
Yeah.
So I've been very good with financial planning.
Yeah, I mean, I'm the same way. Again, finance and real estate background, so you think about that. But yeah, it's akin to professional athletes too, who you think of an NFL player who's got maybe 4 or 5 really good earning years, if they're lucky. What's the plan for the rest of your life? And it's funny, like when you get to a point where you do save a lot, and then when you do need to dip into it, it's weird because it's almost taboo because you look at it, you're like, well, this is my savings. I don't touch my savings. And then you have to realize like, oh, this is what savings are for. It's for actually moments like this. Like, it's okay because I can build back up. It's all going to work out. But, this isn't for when I'm 65. This is for now. And then I will need to start contributing back to it. But it's what it's for. But it's hard to do that. It's hard to start cashing out stocks when you're like, I'm so used to not ever even looking at this account.
Yeah, you've got to be disciplined. I've got accounts that like I refuse to touch. So when money comes into my writing business, I've got automated systems that journal funds to different types of accounts. So one goes towards real estate, one goes towards advertising, another one goes towards savings, this one goes towards stock. And like I get it out of there as quickly as I can because if I see it in that checking account available to spend, it gets spent. So like I got to take that temptation away and just get it out of there.
Yeah, and then because then I'm sure you've coached on this as well, and when you talk to other writers, there's the one predictable thing is the unpredictability of a writer's career. It is not linear by any stretch of the imagination. There are massive gaps in success, if there's success at all. And success can come 20 years in, success can come on book 1, and then be that number 18 song that fizzles, after that. So you can't rely on any kind of steady income stream, and it can all just go away. And you're probably sick of talking about it to this point, but like, the controversy you had earlier this year, it's scary because you're like, this was when we were talking about uncontrollable things. And I don't know if you want to explain it a little bit, but an uncontrollable, as far as I read the situation with you, kind of uncontrollable, like this, I had no idea, and it could torpedo your career.
Yeah. So let me ask you a question. Have you ever sent a text to the wrong person?
Yes.
Yeah. So I think everybody has. So that's essentially what happened to me, but on an insanely large scale. So I had a new book coming out called Behind a Closed Door, which is an erotic thriller. Was marketed at the time as 50 Shades meets David Fincher's The Gray, or The Game.
Mhm.
Um, and that was the film people came up with that, and it sold. I mean, we sold the film rights and it got optioned immediately, like before we sold anything on the publishing side. So
Wow.
every marketing conversation that we had was basically geared towards that. We had 5 different PR firms that were working on this book, and one of them, their entire focus was adult type content on social media, spicy content, and not necessarily for books or movies. Like one of their most successful campaigns is called Cupid Cologne. But they're just very good at creating viral little snippets. So we worked with this PR firm that data mined a group of influencers, and there was about 500 or 600 of them on this mailing list that they put together that create racy adult type content to push whatever product it is you need to sell. So in this case, it happened to be a book. So we created that mailing list. My assistant went in, and we use Mailchimp, which I guess most authors do,
Yeah.
for my emails. We've got a template that we use for pretty much anything. So anytime we create a new email message, we go in and we copy that template, and then we just customize it for whatever the message is. So working with this PR firm, he created an email that was meant to go out to this group of influencers, and there was certain information that had to be in there. There was information on the book. There was ideas for the influencers based on what they felt would work. There was just a pricing scale based on the number of followers that these influencers had, and this is information that is standard in the industry if you're targeting influencers. Like, this is what they expect to see when that email
Right.
lands in their inbox.
Right. They're used
because
to it.
it's yeah, that's their thing. So we created this whole message. We set it up, saved it, and scheduled it. This was, I think, September of last year. Scheduled it to go out in January, and that was it. And let it go. But my assistant, when he created all this, he forgot one particular step, and it was a minor step, but a very big one. So in the mailing list, or the email itself, he never changed the default mailing list.
Right.
So
You can,
instead of
in
you're
MailChimp,
supposed
it's a drop down of, like, you might have 10 different mailing lists, and you have to select the one that you
Right.
want that to go to.
Yeah, so it was supposed to go to this group of paid influencers that create adult racy content. And instead, he forgot to change it. So that email ended up going out to our default mailing list of book reviewers, who obviously had no clue what it was when it landed in their inbox.
Is
Obviously
this
got
that 3 to
very-
4,000 person list that you were alluding to earlier?
Yeah. So,
Yeah.
and I had no idea that this happened. So, like, this was, I think, January 26, 27, something like that. I got a phone call from my agent. He's like, "Hey, there's something going on TikTok about you. You may want to check it out." And I logged in and I searched, and I was like, "What is it?" Then I realized that it was this campaign, and we started actually getting people that were clicking on it and responding and signing up to do it. So I wasn't sure. Like, at this point, I didn't know that it had gone to the wrong list.
Right.
But over the course of maybe 3 hours, this happened very, very quickly. It went from 2 or 3 TikTok videos to NBC, Today Show, Publishers Weekly, all these big entities basically reaching out. And like, I was responding without knowing what actually happened,
Right.
which was a big mistake. I'd never dealt with anything like this before. So it was completely reactionary. So I put out one apology real quick before I had a clue of what was even happening, put out another apology right after that. Then I spoke to somebody that works in crisis management, and they told me, no, just keep quiet, let the dust settle, because no matter what you say at this point, they're going to take out the 1 or 2 sentences that they could use to basically fuel the fire. Because ultimately what this is about is, people are trying to create likes and clicks. They're trying to draw traffic to their own channel. So they want to come up with the most salacious story that they possibly can tell to keep that going and fuel that fire and keep it going and going. So even once we figured out exactly what went wrong, which was, it was an honest mistake. My assistant recorded a video. He was going to put it up on YouTube and say, "Hey, I did this. This is, screenshots. This is what I did. This is what went wrong." Like, there was just no point in doing that, because me as the public face of this whole thing, I had already taken the hit. It didn't make sense to throw, a 20-some-year-old kid under the bus, because
Yeah.
it wouldn't change anything.
No.
But we sent all that information onto the NBC, Today Show, all these people that had reviewed put out the initial story, thinking that they would amend their story once they actually had the truth, and they didn't. And that was a huge wake up call for me. I
No one
realized,
did.
like, nobody did. They didn't
Yeah.
care what the truth was, because the truth wasn't, everybody has sent a text to the wrong person.
Yeah.
Like, as soon as you realize that's what happened, it's, oh, that's it. Like,
Right.
it's not a fun story anymore. So they
Because the
refused to report
content
on
of
it.
the original message would have been totally appropriate for the list that it was intended.
Right. If it would have gone to the correct people, they would have got it. Those ads would have been created. They would have went out in the market no different than any other product ad,
Yeah.
created by paid influencers. It would have been a non-event. It's just because it went to the wrong people. And I totally understand why that group of the wrong people reacted the way that they did, because
Right.
I
Totally.
probably would have too.
Right.
But there was no way to unring that bell.
Right.
I've done interviews, I talk about it and stuff like this. I mean, it's a cautionary tale, to be honest with you, because
Yeah.
one of the things that happens when you start growing your author business is you do bring in other people to manage certain aspects of it,
Right.
and you can't micromanage. So
Right.
sometimes things go wrong, but you have to own up and take responsibility for it.
For sure. And even aside from the fact that as you get bigger, you're expanding your network and your team, you are just simply exposed to more readers. And I remember Louis C.K. talking about this years ago, before his controversy, saying like when he started to get big, he's like, now I'm reaching people who I'm not their taste. And that's where you start to see like, oh, I'm kind of famous now. And that's not necessarily a good thing. And that's without any controversy going on. But, then it doesn't take much, right? It doesn't take much to start that brush fire. And in the case of, like you said, sending the wrong text, had that happened with your first book to much smaller lists, nobody would have known about it.
Yeah, it would have been done. And, I for a good 5 minutes there, I contemplated like, am I done? Like, is this it? Is it over? But I've worked way too hard, and once I powered through it, like I realized like it honestly really was a non-event. It didn't impact the book sales at all. The movie moved forward. Everything in the world went on. Nobody cares at this point.
Did your agent drop you though?
Well, they took that out of context. So I was with Writer's House, but at the time, I don't know how familiar you are with my publishing history, but like my last couple of books I published through basically a hybrid model. So I indie published in English domestically, and then my agent sold the foreign rights on those books. So I kind of got the best of both worlds.
Interesting.
So when we were shopping behind a closed door, I got a phone call. It looked like the book was going to auction. All the publishers wanted it. And I got a phone call from a friend of mine that works at Penguin Random House. And she said, listen, we're about to offer on your book and you need to turn it down. And I said, why? And she said, well, we're about to lay off a bunch of people and the editor that wants your book is one of them.
My God.
And like a month later, those layoffs happened. And I got a similar phone call from somebody at HarperCollins telling me the same thing. And the layoffs happened there too. So it got me really nervous because being in this world, I've known authors that have had books picked up by an editor or a publisher where those kind of things happen and your book can end up in limbo forever.
Right.
So I had already been talking to the folks at Simon & Schuster, having come out of the finance world. I knew people that worked for the private equity firm that bought Simon & Schuster. So I had conversations going on with them. So ultimately what we created, they signed my imprint to Simon & Schuster. So I basically have my own publishing house now through Simon & Schuster, and they handle my print distribution and sales.
Oh, that's great.
So it's like the best of both worlds. But the flip side of that is if, Writer's House or, any agent really in the US, like they really don't want to deal with that because the bulk of their income comes from the sales of those domestic books.
Right.
Like they want to sell English rights. They want to sell world rights. They don't want to be limited to, foreign countries. So my agent at Writer's House, like we had already had these conversations. So he knew that this was my business model. Moving forward, it was very unlikely that they would be selling any of my titles domestically. So we were already looking at how do we, split, part ways because I needed an agent that focused solely on foreign distribution, not so much domestic. So it was a catalyst. Like within a month of the book coming out, we were going to cut ties anyway. And I moved on to another agent that handles strictly foreign rights, which was the plan all along. But it basically, like anything else, it lit the fuse. But we're still friends. We still talk. I still send him clients when I get somebody who's got a decent book. The world goes on.
Yeah, it's just it is a cautionary tale because then you Google anyone's name and then like, okay, this is what appears next for the first 2 years after it happened. This non-event, but because it can get pulled, and I'm not trying to minimalize it because, like to your point, that what that went out to the standard list, you can understand why a lot of the people were upset. Again, honest mistake, but then then you've got the Scarlet Letter, at least on your internet search for a little while, and it's just part of society today, and it's got to be a really tough thing to navigate through all that.
Well, I mean, all you could really do is do interviews like this where you talk about it, get the truth out there, and
Right,
sooner or
right,
later, everybody's going to know what really happened, and
right.
the ones that are interested in knowing anyway will learn.
And now because I know you have one book out with James Patterson, but you said you've written several. Do you have several published with him, or just that one that just came
Well,
out?
we've got one just came out recently, but we've got I think four that are already published.
Oh,
We've got a
okay.
couple more
Sorry.
that we've
Yeah.
written together that are in the pipeline.
So you have a longer working relationship with James.
Oh yeah, yeah. We've been working together since I think 2020.
Wow. Okay. And that's been I've heard varying stories, but that's been
No,
smooth
he's
for
on.
you.
Yeah, it's funny because at first I assumed it was like you assume that he doesn't do any of the writing, that he brings in the co-authors and they do all the work. He slaps his name on the cover and that's it. And that has not been my experience at all.
Yeah.
If I mean, the first book that we wrote together was called Coast to Coast Murders. It came out in 2020. I'm the first guy to ever get Patterson to work without an outline, and we literally went chapter by chapter. I would paint him into some impossible crazy corner, and I would send him the pages, thinking he's not going to get out of this. And then 15 minutes later, he'd send me back new pages, and not only did he get out of it, but he put me into an even worse spot, and then expected me to get out. And like the whole book is like that. So it's the twistiest thing I've ever written. But then for our second book together, he sent me an outline. He's like, I want you to see how much easier this is to do with an outline. And he was right, so I've been outlining ever since. But he's
But
he's
that's
constantly in my
fascinating.
yeah, he's constantly, when I'm working with him anyway, like we're on the phone a lot, going over every page. We've had several books that have been optioned, where it's not just the two of us weighing in, it's the studio. They're
Yeah.
weighing in like, that's a great scene, but we can't film that. It's too expensive. You got to change this, you got to change that.
Right.
We had a book called The Noise where I think we wrote 6 different endings before we got one that everybody agreed on because there were so many players involved.
That's amazing.
But to me that's fun, and he has taught me so much about writing in general and just how to move a story forward and pacing and characterization and on the business side. I mean, the guy, he came out of the marketing world. He created the Toys R Us theme song of all things. Like he's been around for a
Oh, I
while.
didn't know
Um,
that.
and, yeah, he loves marketing books. Like he will talk marketing all day long. Um, and I picked his brain on that too. I mean, he's largely responsible for my new business model with Simon and Schuster, and a lot of the co-author titles that I've got coming down the pipeline. So he's
Wow.
been a big influence on my life.
That to me, that the idea of, because I don't outline either, and I never have, and I've tried, and it's just, I believe it's such a nature based kind of thing, because I'll start writing to an outline, even if I've outlined the next 3 chapters, and I immediately start thinking of something more interesting or more puts the character in that corner, like you mentioned. And I'm like, I wouldn't have thought of that had I not been in the process of actively, I think. Like, so if I was trying to outline, I wouldn't have thought of this great twist or this great idea. When you're outlining with him or writing from an outline, is a lot of it his outline? Then you're like, okay, I have a roadmap and I have a vision, and that makes it easier? Or is it your own outline where it's like, see, if it were my own outline, I would immediately want to change it?
Yeah, I mean, it just depends on the project. With something like The Noise, he sent me, I think he had about 2/3 of the story. And I was like, this is fantastic. I mean, because it was his first stab at a horror novel. I actually got Stephen
Oh,
King to read it and he blurbed it. So yeah,
that's
Stephen King
awesome.
blurbed a James Patterson book. But when he sent me the outline, I was like, this is great. Like, where does it go though? What's the end? He's like, I've got no fucking idea. You got to figure that out. Um, and then we went back and forth on that ending over and over again. But when you're on the phone brainstorming with somebody like that, like he takes it to a whole other level.
Wow.
And that's part of the fun. I mean, honestly, like the way he explained this to me, like I go for a run every day. So I'd finish up my writing around 3 o'clock, and then I go and run 4 miles around this island that I live on. And I use that time to figure out what I'm going to write tomorrow. So back when I was pantsing novels, I'd finish up my scene in the morning, I'd go for that run, and I would think about what I'm going to write tomorrow. And you can it's almost like outlining, but it's like seeing through the fog where you're just a little further ahead of where you're actually writing.
Right.
Um, But what I've noticed is once I have an outline, like, before with pantsing, when I'm doing that, I used to spend all that time on my run thinking about what comes next, what comes next, what comes next. If I've got an outline in my hand, I use that same time to figure out how do I make what comes next better, because I already know what's coming. So like, how do I
Yeah.
twist it? How do I come up with those things like you just mentioned to
Right.
make it from 80% to 110%. Um,
Interesting.
and I find that there's a lot less words on the cutting room floor. I used to write typically 140 to 160,000 words on a book, and then
Oh,
I would cut
wow.
it down to 100,000 by the time I published.
Yeah. Right.
Almost
Right.
almost like trimming the fat off of a steak. You just get it as
Right.
lean as you possibly can. When I'm
Yeah.
working with an outline, I don't have as much trimming. I mean, by the time I hit the last page, the book is more or less done. It's just some little cleanup, and I'm good to go. So to
Yeah.
me, it's more efficient.
Yeah.
But everybody's different. You got to try everything. When you're writing a book, figure out what works for you.
Yeah, I just co-wrote something for the first time, and we kind of came up with an outline together. And then I did most of the writing, and I did find it like very, very fast, very it's still. And I was worried that I would lose a little bit of the joy, because the actual writing is where I get the joy of, like, when you're visualizing, when you're seeing what's happening, and then when you have those what if moments. And I was afraid I was going to lose that, and I really didn't. I'm like, I'm so excited to make this now come alive. So you have a good point there, but I don't think I would have been able to outline it on my own. So, but maybe it's just a matter of practice. I don't know. Oh,
Yeah, for me, it's been practice. The first outline was a huge pain, and now I've gotten pretty decent at it.
got it. Well, JD, we're going to wrap up. Before we do, we're going to do a quick storytelling of our own. This is the making it up, speaking of not outlining, section of the show. I've got 3 books that I picked from random off my bookshelves. And you're going to choose one of those books, and we're going to choose a random sentence from a random page. I'm going to read that sentence, and then that'll be the first sentence and maybe a 2 or 3 minute long short story. So I'll read that sentence, then you give me the next 1 or 2 sentences of what you think happens. I'll do a couple sentences, and then I'll shoot it in the kneecaps when it starts getting agonizing.
Oh boy, you expect this to happen without coffee?
You can have as much coffee as you want. I've already had 3 cups, so
I'm done with my coffee for the day, but I'll give it a shot.
I've got Mark Guggenheim's In Any Lifetime, Clare Mackintosh's A Game of Lies, and Linda Castillo's The Burning. So choose one of those.
Let's go with Claire. I'm going to be at a retreat in Greece with her, a writer's retreat next year.
Oh, you are? She's lovely, by the way.
Yeah, she's a great person, really nice.
Lovely person. Give me a page between 1 and 350.
247.
Okay, I'm going to quickly scan page 247 and just pull out a line that might work for the first sentence. Let's see here. I usually try to find something pretty basic to make it a little bit easier to start with. This is all right. It's just a quote. This woman named Izzy is saying, "He's not your murderer," Izzy says.
All right, so it's my job to come up with the next sentence.
Whatever you want to do. Yeah. He's not your murderer, Izzy says.
I killed that person 6 days ago.
I couldn't believe she just admitted that to me so nonchalantly. But then again, she knew I wasn't in a position to do anything about it. How did you do it? I asked Izzy.
The same way I'm going to kill you.
I looked at her face. Usually I can detect the crack of a lie. It's always in the eyes. I didn't even have to look this time. I knew she was telling the truth. I also knew by the stiletto in her left hand.
Ooh. All right, now I'm stuck. See, this is the part where I go on a run.
We can call it there.
Yeah, let's call it there. That's fun, though.
Yeah, it's always interesting to see kind of where the story goes, and it usually goes immediately dark. Doesn't matter what sentence we use to begin with, it almost immediately goes to somebody's going to kill somebody. So I don't know if that's my influence after 150 of these episodes.
Just like real life.
Exactly. Well, JD, it was great meeting you and talking to you. I don't know if you'll be at BoucherCon, but I'll be there, I think, next month or so. But hope to get to meet you in person someday.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Take care. So that's it. That is my conversation with J.D. Barker. Made up a little a little murdery kind of story there towards the end. Fairly short, but that's okay. I think it had a lot of potential. Yeah, that was a great conversation. I really enjoyed. I enjoyed how honest and forthright he was about everything. And so it was kind of fascinating for me to learn, look at his life and just see the ups and downs and see this progression. And it all stems from not only obviously writing good stories first and foremost, but having a passion, having an immediate and almost all-encompassing passion for what you do does beget success. If you place that passion above your desire to think you're going to hit it big with something. So that was a good lesson for me to listen to. If you want to find out more about JD, just go to jdbarker.com. And if you want to find out more about me or buy my books, subscribe to my newsletter, read my blog, or watch episodes of this show, just go to carterwilson.com. And if you're interested in immersive coaching and writing retreats, one-on-one coaching, or online classes, check out my company, unboundwriter.com. That's it, folks. That's this episode for today. Another episode out just next week. Thank you, as always, for watching and or listening. Take care.